Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. I'm Hal. I lead startups at OpenAI, in particular, our work with later stage startups. Been at the company for 2-ish years now, and really excited to share a little bit with everyone in terms of what we've learned over the last little while. And thank you for being here this morning. Maybe before I get started, I'll just get one thing out of the way. Our model names are just freaking insane to keep up with these days. We had 4.0 mini, and then someone internally was like, hey, let's also launch 0.4 mini. That's not going to be confusing at all. It's something we're going to fix. We're working on it. But in the meantime, feel free to at me, at Sam. We deserve all the memes. More seriously, we'll just cover 2 topics today. Hopefully, we'll spend the next 20, 30 minutes on some of these topics. I also want to make this pretty conversational. So if anyone has a question while I'm just going through stuff, feel free to raise your hand, and hopefully we can find some time to call on you. But want to make this as casual and conversational as possible. We'll cover 2 things. One is, why do we spend so much time thinking about startups and founders at OpenAI? And we'll also talk a little bit about over the last couple of years, what have we learned in terms of practical guidance if you're building an AI product or startup. We'll also share a few things at the end. If you want to get in touch with us and work with us, what's kind of the best way to do that? We always start with this. This hasn't changed basically since forever. Our mission is to ensure AGI benefits all of humanity. This is really important to us. We believe in it, and startups are a direct part of that mission. Because startups give us the most direct, the most advanced feedback in terms of how AI applications are working in the real world, and they're often on the bleeding edge of creating things that didn't exist before, and pushing us to create products and models and capabilities that we often haven't thought about, and that really helps us influence the direction of our roadmap, where our models are going, where our products are going, and hopefully all of that feedback helps us create better products for founders and startups to scale their business. The team that I'm on focuses strictly on making startups successful. Over the last couple of years, we've had the privilege of working with some of the most category-defining startups, and hopefully we've made a small impact in their journey of becoming successful. But our team is super focused on making sure startups and founders are successful. And when I started at OpenAI, our team was just 3 people. But over the last little while, we've invested a lot in making sure that we're where startups are, where founders are. We've expanded to a ton of different countries and regions, and hopefully in the future we're able to serve all of you as best as we can and be where founders and startups are. We'll touch on this a little bit more as well, but over the last little while, as we've increased how much our models are more capable, startups' feedback has been a direct part of making sure that models are moving in the right direction. Very often, before we launch a model, or as we're even pre-training a model, we'll think a little bit about, can startups give us feedback? Are things moving in the right direction? How can we build the next model that's not just going to be more intelligent, but more practical and more aligned to real use cases that startups and founders are actually building towards. We'll touch on kind of 3 themes as we pivot towards what have we kind of learned practically in terms of observations and strategies of successful AI startups that are scaling on OpenAI over the last couple of years. There's kind of 3 things that's held true over the last 2 years. One is starting off with really representative evals that's going to help you make good decisions. I think this is kind of the cornerstone of basically building any AI application, and we'll dive a little bit more into what that means and what we have observed. The second part is, there's often a lot of models that are coming out. There's also a lot of new techniques and approaches in terms of how you can customize your model or make the model do the things that you want. The advice here is, how do you incrementally optimize for your model and customize for your model so that you're actually getting the results you want, but also in a timely and fast and efficient way. And we'll touch a little bit on the themes that we're going to continue to see in LLMs and in AI, so that as you're thinking about building your AI application and product, you're leaning into these model tailwinds and building for the trends and the macros of where the industry is going versus for maybe at a specific point in time. So we'll touch on evals first. And evals, I think over the last couple of years, has only gotten more and more important. When I started, Greg was basically hey, evals is the thing like basically the only thing you need. It's the building blocks, and over 2 years later, evals are actually becoming a competitive advantage for startups if you have really good understandings of what good looks like. That will help you scale. That will help you build better products. And I think it's actually becoming more and more important to start here versus being really tempted to just jump into building a product. We'll touch a little bit on just like what evals are. I think it's like kind of a new term, or like at least a term that's like fairly unique to LLMs and AI. But the highest level is just like evals is a way for you to know whether or not what you're doing with LLMs is actually moving in the right direction. There's a lot of ways to, again, tune a model, prompt a model, but because models are inherently, at least out of the box, generalized and non-deterministic, how do you actually know that it's going to be doing the thing that you want it to do? We recommend founders and startups and builders to, as soon as you can, basically start to figure out like what good looks like. We call it a golden data set or a golden benchmark, but it's a way for you to evaluate if I do X, is output Y going to be the thing that's moving the needle in terms of moving it closer and closer to like my golden data set and the examples that I actually want. We think about AI development in a couple of different phases. Evals kind of stands like pretty early on in terms of like what's critical. Typically, founders and builders will start with an idea. They have a hypothesis on what will work. Here's like a problem I'm trying to solve. This is where AI can have a lot of impact in this workflow. And then evals typically come very shortly after, basically thinking a little bit about what does good look like for this particular use case, figuring out that data set and iteratively testing that hypothesis to make sure that the results of these evals are actually moving in the right direction. Only then are you able to actually deploy ways to optimize this model. If you didn't even know what good looked like, it's going to be very difficult for you to say hey, I'm going to try prompt A, prompt B, prompt C, but I'm getting all these different outputs. Is it actually moving my model in the right direction? And only when you know what good looks like and you're moving your model and outputs in the right direction, can you start to focus on ways to optimize for scale, which includes everything from latency and cost and trying to scale from 5 users to 1 million users. That's when evals become really, really critical. We'll touch a little bit about after you have good evals, what does it mean to actually customize and get models to do the thing that you want to do? Often it can be really challenging to, there's a ton of different models out there, a ton of different ways to get different outputs, from fine-tuning to prompt engineering to retrievals. Where do you start, and what is the thing that is most rational for you to start with? We think about model customization in generally 2 different axes. The first axis is model knowledge or model context. This has to do with what the model knows. So if you take kind of an out-of-the-box generalized LLM, it's got this knowledge cutoff date. If you have proprietary information that you want the model to reason over, it's not going to have any of that knowledge, right? So the first axis we think about customizing your model to get the results that you want is through customizing for model context. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. The second axis we think about is model behavior, what it says, how it thinks, its tone, and even formatting, right? I think that's where fine-tuning becomes really important and helps you kind of optimize for the output of your models. Prompt engineering is kind of where we think is the cheapest, easiest, and fastest way to get started. Almost always when a builder or a startup or a founder is coming to us for the first time asking, where should we start? Prompt engineering actually gets you pretty far. We recommend people actually just start with prompt engineering, trying a few different techniques, and then moving up the chain and trying something new and iterating and putting everything together to see if it's moving in the right direction. You can kind of see where evals becomes really important here, because all of these techniques, they're not deterministic. It's not going to give you the exact output you might be expecting. So a lot of testing is necessary, and through that testing, you need to know what are you testing for, what's good, and we're just going to keep touching on evals as part of what's important in this whole framework. Where we see builders and startups get started is maybe something like this. It's not necessarily deterministic in terms of this is the path you always have to take, but this is a really common path where you just start with prompt engineering, see if it's moving your evals in the right direction. You're like, hey, that's pretty good. Maybe I can do some more sophisticated prompt engineering. Oh, and that's moving my evals even closer to what I want. And then you're starting to think about, OK, maybe the model doesn't really have the context that I need. So let's start to like retrieve and add context through some simple reg procedures. And that's moving your evals closer and closer to the right direction. And then maybe you'll start to like put everything together with fine-tuning. You're like, hey, like I think I have like all the right model outputs and knowledge and context and prompting techniques now, but I want the model to sound a different way or like to format its outputs in a different way. And you start to like fine-tune. You start putting all of this together, and this is an iterative process that can take time, but that time is dramatically accelerated with the help of like you actually understanding like what's good, what's a strong eval, and what's like a good performance for your models as you're pursuing all of these different techniques. And as you figure out, like, hey, like, there's a bunch of different techniques, and we have great evals, and we're pushing our models in the right direction. What's really important to think about is, where is LLMs, where is AI, where is the industry heading over the next couple of years? And the best way to actually think about that is if you take a look backwards on what we've observed, I think that trend is likely to continue. And the kind of two big macro trends that we observe over the last little while and is going to continue is one, models are getting smarter and they're getting smarter faster. And the second one is models are getting more economical and more affordable, and that's unlocking more and more use cases. Let's kind of just touch on like 2 data points here, but if you think about like a model, like the reasoning models as well as the non-reasoning models, over time, they've just kept getting smarter. And not have they kept getting smarter, they've also kept getting cheaper. This is a really weird industry and company to work for, where like the product isn't just getting better, the better product is also getting cheaper. If I think about like companies that were building on GPT-4 like 2 years ago, that price is like 10x cheaper now. It went from $36 per million tokens to less than $4 per million tokens. If you were a startup that really built for GPT-4 back in the day and you got your use case to really work, you're starting to see the benefits of putting in like the work around the evals, putting in the work around making sure that you're customizing the models to the right approach. And then at this point in time, because the models are so affordable now, you can actually scale something out to millions and millions of users. Same holds true for some of our newer models, like the reasoning ones. One piece of takeaway that I have from like all of this and from just working with startups and founders and observing the industry over the last couple of years is I don't think you need to wait for like the perfect timing to launch a product and to like build for your use case. I think a lot of folks will kind of look at this and say like, oh, like 01, 03 is like too expensive right now. But the observation might be a little counterintuitive, which is if you just kind of like focus on solving for your use case and your problem, the economics and the tailwinds will typically take care of themselves, where you're not only just going to get better and better models, but you're going to get cheaper and cheaper models as well at that intelligence level. And you're not only going to be able to scale out your existing use case, but you're actually going to be able to find additional use cases as well. I blasted through a lot of this content. Like I said, I really want to make this conversation like pretty casual, and I'd love to have conversation with like you guys more than anything. I'll touch a little bit on how to work with OpenAI and typically what we see a customer's journey might look like if they decide to work with us. But really would love to actually like just spend more time on Q&A. But typically, working with OpenAI, you might get started with just our APIs are super public. They're very accessible and it's very easy to start with. At the ideation phase, it's actually faster for builders and founders and startups to just spin up an API key, create a project, start testing what works and what doesn't. Once startups start to get to this phase where they're starting to see product market fit, or they're starting to like have a high conviction of this is what I want to build, how can you help me do it? Our team jumps in directly to support you through that journey. And then kind of the third phase, which I spend a lot of time on, is when you are scaling from just a couple users or like a beta phase or an alpha phase into something to the market, and you're scaling into millions and millions and millions of users, how do we help you scale that anywhere from optimizing for latency, optimizing for speed and cost, and helping you get into these markets? That's what we obsess with, and helping you guys be successful. So with that being said, we have a ton of time for Q&A, so I'll just pause here for any questions that folks may have. Yes? Oh, I think we have a mic runner as well. Oh, here we go.
I'd love to hear about like some of the use cases that you're talking about, like 1 to 2 startup examples that you don't have to name, but like how they have been able to iterate on their process and improve things, and like sort of why you think those were successful.
Yeah, I think like a few things. Like one, I will say, we're very strongly opinionated about evals now. I don't think we were as strongly opinionated about evals back in like 2022, 2023. So a lot of startups actually did not get started with evals, and then like a year later, 2 years later, they're like, oh man, like models are coming out pretty fast. I kind of want to know like how I can switch from like this much more expensive model like GPT-4 to like a much cheaper model like GPT-4 Turbo, GPT-4.1. And it actually took them a lot of time because they basically just scaled up with a vibe-based approach, and they're like, well, I don't know if this like model is actually going to give me like the right output that I want. So, working with like these startups, again, just like starting with evals and being really opinionated on what works. What I typically see for startups where they have done a great job iterating is they have some specialized knowledge and opinionated approach on like, this is exactly what works really well. So when I work with legal startups, for example, they have lawyers who are like, this is what good looks like. When I work with healthcare companies, they have doctors who are telling them this is what good looks like. And when I think about evals, it's not just like everything has to be like automated and you have one person like looking at what these things look like, but very often like these evals actually have human in the loop, where an expert is looking at model outputs from like this model or this like other model, and they're saying like, yes, like the outputs here generally are like better than the previous one.
Could you please explain, how do you go about when you start building something? Is it, there's so many tools out there to use, like N8N, for example, and 11 Labs and for
Sure.
voice. I mean, how do you like start? I mean, would you just like start coding like plain, simple on your software, and then you start using these tools, or you just like get the tools because it's easier, it's shortcut, but then at some point you reach a stage where you actually need more flexibility and the tool doesn't allow you to?
Yeah. So maybe the question is kind of like, where do you start? But I think like where do you start is typically like start focusing on like, hey, here's like the problem I want to solve, and here's like the use case I want to build, and then working backwards from that. So if your use case, for example, or the problem you're trying to solve doesn't require something like audio, you might not need to actually have like an audio endpoint or like tinker with that as part of your process. But if you're like, hey, like I want to solve for this thing, and then here's like my range of options, the actual easiest place to start is to just like actually just go into like the products that you need, start to like test all of these different things. I'm super aware that like there's a ton of different models out there now, and I actually encourage like all of the builders who are starting off for the first time to look at all of these different models and start to run them through your pipeline and say, oh, like this model actually works the best for this part of the workflow, and then a different model works best for like this part of the workflow. But I think like generally like these models and APIs are super accessible now, so testing should be like fairly quick.
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
One is, what is extra stuff you're giving startups that you don't give the rest of our humans?
Sorry, what's the first question?
What's extra stuff that you give startups, resources, time, whatever, that you don't give regular humans?
Oh, yeah. So we work with startups in terms of like, so typically like API credits, office hours, stuff like that, and that's all kind of done like through. I'll just go. Can we go back a slide? Yeah. If you register over there, like we'll start to get in touch and get you the resources you need.
And my second question was, since you talked about that 2x2, why would a startup not start with RAG? I mean, if it's fine, it's prompt engineering, then they just come to ChatGPT and then we are irrelevant, right?
Yeah. I think like, I'm not saying like don't do RAG or like not even like start with RAG. I think like the easiest place to start is actually like prompt engineering. It's like the fastest, cheapest, and like way to get started. My recommendation is like start with prompt engineering, see if you're getting the model to like behave and act in a way that you want, and then start to layer in RAG. You'll probably like start to like fine-tune your prompt, not like fine-tune, it's kind of like a loaded technical term these days, but you'll probably want to change your like prompt engineering prompts as you like layer RAG into it to get that specialized knowledge. But I think you'll learn a lot just through kind of like that fast, cheap process of prompt engineering to see like what works for your use case and what doesn't. Over there.
What are your thoughts on synthetic data for evals?
I think there's a use case for them. Yeah, I think they work. It kind of depends on the use case. Yeah. Maybe we'll just like hit this side of the room.
We do applications for business to business. So what's your opinion that these large companies do not want to give us the data to put into our AI? They want to put it into their AI. So we could be working with Chevron and then 5 minutes later with Exxon, and they don't want to see anything shared. It's super confidential. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, like I work a lot with like B2B companies as well, and there's like typically like security things that we make sure like they're comfortable with. So I think it depends on exactly like what some of those requirements are that you're seeing. Kind of curious to hear like what you're seeing in particular, but like for customers who have really high concerns and are eligible, we do something called like zero data retention. So we just don't save that data. By default, we don't train any data off of our APIs, so all of that data is secure. And for customers who like really need it, there's like certain guarantees we make in terms of like data locality and residency as well. So I think generally we've done pretty well with satisfying business concerns and data concerns and security concerns, but if there's anything specific, feel free to like find me afterwards. Take one from like the audience back there.
Hi. So I think the previous participant answered one of my questions around security. So we're in the federal government space, so we have federal government clients, and security and privacy is a big deal.
Yeah.
But the also thing is the personas are controlling users and the access to data.
Okay.
How can we control certain access to data if everyone's using the same system?
Are you thinking about like single tenancy, things like that, or
Yeah.
something else? Something we're working on, I think like generally like, I'll answer this from like a technical standpoint, and I'll answer it from like, what I see from customers. Like from a technical standpoint, single tenancy is something we're working towards. From a customer standpoint, I think like if you're working with the government, that's a pretty unique space. I think there's like pretty unique challenges of like how we can serve federal or like state level governments, but
Yeah,
they have some pretty unique.
that would be a
unique
great
stuff.
conversation I'd like to have with you later.
Yeah, I'm happy to have this.
We have
conversation with you
we have
later as
current
well.
federal clients who's that exact question, and so that's their number one concern. So.
Yeah, and is it like building on like models or like using ChatGPT or something else?
Well, it's more specialized, right?
More
So
specialized.
You can't just use a generalized AI model API it and wrap it, because that's not going to work. So
Yeah.
you have to
I know for a lot of these companies, they want to host their own models, like serve it in their own infrastructure, and they don't want to use something like hosting it off of like our data centers and APIs. It's like not something we do today, but happy to have this conversation with you afterwards as well.
Thank you. I'll just hand it to you. How's that?
Yeah, so obviously you're with OpenAI here, but what are your opinions on the other innovations and trends out there, and when, I guess, a startup should go with integrating your models versus other tools out there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I mentioned this earlier on. I actually think like builders should test out every single model. There's like a lot of these models out there now. Other labs have like very capable models. Like there's a lot of capable open source models out there now. I think there's like trade-offs, advantages of like, maybe like the first one is like, do you think about open source or do you think about something that's more closed source? I think there's advantages and disadvantages of like going to either parties. And the other question is like, well, do I use like one of OpenAI's models or do I use like a different closed source model? And I think like what you'll find there is like different models are really capable for different use cases. So it kind of comes back down to like, what's your use case? What are you trying to solve for? And then start to like narrow down the list of like, here are the relevant models and products and SKUs, and start to like experiment and tinker with what gets you the best output from all of these things. But yeah, like everyone has pretty capable models now. We'll take a question over there.
Hi, my question's about model evaluation. We're working with example. We're still working on 4 turbo applications, and we're stuck there for some use cases because the performance looks a certain output looks a certain way. Want to scale to 4.1. The marketing is it's faster, it's cheaper, it's just as performant. Wondering, in your experience with customers you work with, the eval loop, what percentage of that is automated eval versus human in the loop, 70, 30%?
Yeah.
And how often are humans going back in to re-establish new automated testing evals?
What is your use case if you're willing to share?
It's like market research, kind of data aggregation. So we're aggregating, coalescing data to produce insights and analysis outputs. And For Turbo, for some aggregation, looks and feels more human readable
Yeah.
than for one.
What makes it feel more human, more readable?
Less verbose, more concise,
Okay.
gets to the point faster.
I would start to like think about, that doesn't immediately strike me as something that needs like a ton of human in the loop. I would start to like put your thoughts into like actual words and data of like, this is like 100 examples of what actually I want in terms of like vibes or verboseness or tone and stuff like that. And then I actually think like a lot of this can probably be automated through like a model graded eval where you get a different model to look at this and say like, hey, does this actually meet my criteria based on like tone and verbosity, right? I think like human in the loop criteria, like I see them a lot in specialized use cases. So for example, legal, medical, customer service actually, where you're like, I have a very specialized way of responding to my customers. And I want a person to actually look at this before I fire it off. But I think that use case I can probably lean more towards like automated evals and auto-gradable evals. Take a question back there.
What's your advice on, I guess, investing or like capitalizing on, I guess, improving model costs and improving model capabilities?
Solve for like the problem today. Don't worry too much about cost if you can help it. Like I said, I think like what I've seen with like other customers and startups and building on top of our APIs was a lot of them honestly started building on like GPT-4 and they told me, hey, it's super expensive, we can't scale, and the advice was that the cost drops are coming. It'll be easier to scale in the future. Yeah. I got a question over here.
Outside of models, what does the OpenAI ecosystem offer? Let's say RAGs, your own custom eval benchmarks that we can use to evaluate our models?
I don't think we're super opinionated on this is exactly how you're going to eval a model outside of like the public benchmarks we have that we test our own models on. So for example, like Sweetbench, Aider, stuff like that. But those are pretty common and you can kind of take a look at those. I would say like for people who are building their own AI applications, everyone's evals is probably going to look a little bit different or like very different. So I think that's what you should probably spend more time on.
And what about having, let's say, your own RAG that we can integrate with your models?
Yeah. So we actually we have a few like out-of-the-box RAG solutions. So we have our responses API, which we launched not too long ago, which allows for you to upload files in there and call it as a tool. So that's kind of like a RAG way that you could use, but obviously a lot of different solutions in terms of how you can solve for that. Cool. Question over there.
Hi. So are you working on anything like Alpha Evolve that like has ensembles of LLMs or ensembles of agents like working together?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Are you or OpenAI working on anything similar to Alpha Evolve from Google that's like ensembles of LLMs and ensembles of agents working together?
Oh, some of the like agents working together?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think like generally like agents is going to be the direction we head in over like this year and then next year. I'm actually not 100% sure on like the specifics of like exactly like what you're asking for, whether that's something we're working on, but feels like directionally like makes sense. Cool. Maybe one more question over here.
Yeah, regarding kind of the same topic, for example, PDFs, right? There's some models, even ChatGPT has difficulty in reading PDFs, even like text PDFs that for some reason you can extract the text. How do you work with that? I mean, can you use like some outside tool and also all the information that you put, let's say when you create a project, is it only like whatever you upload there as instruction or as a file that stays? Or in the conversation, do you need to set up for it to save like all the information that you put in there? So whenever you're talking to this project, it knows it's the same thing. Like sometimes it's a bit hard to understand what stays in the memory as a RAG, let's say, and what is discarded.
Yeah, I'm actually a little less familiar with like the underlying like architecture of like ChatGPT and the RAG system. But if you're like kind of talking about like, how do I RAG PDFs as part of like you're building this thing? Oh, by the way, like I probably should have mentioned, like I focus on like working with like startups and builders on top of like our models and APIs. So that's like where I have like the most amount of expertise. But if you're thinking about like, hey, like ragging PDFs as part of your workflow, I think that's like largely kind of a solved problem. You can use kind of like a variety of different embedding models and vector databases to like make that work for you. Cool. Maybe I'll take like this question and that one.
Hey, about the trend in cost improvements, what do you think are the drivers there, and why do you think that trend will continue?
Oh, cost improvements? Models are getting more and more efficient. I think we learn a lot ourselves in terms of how to optimize for models and underlying infrastructure and compute. So over time, like as models get bigger, you're not just kind of like, as models get bigger, you're not serving them on like the same like ratio amount of compute. And we're finding ways to make that more and more efficient like all the time. Cool, there's like one more back there.
Thank you for your time. We know that OpenAI is working on doing its own open source model. So my question is around that. What prompted that, and to what can startup founders expect out of that model in terms of capabilities and weights? Anything that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think Sam's kind of like talked a little bit about why we wanted to do it. We think it's like the right direction. I don't have a ton to share with you in terms of like exactly what that looks like. Honestly, like it's just super early on. I'm not even trying to like hide anything. We're still trying to learn from the community on exactly what they want to see, and that will inform what we build.
Any timelines that we have, estimates of when the model will be out?
Could be between tomorrow and the next 10 years.
Next 10 years. That's a cool answer. Thank you.
All right, maybe one more question over here.
Thank you again. Does OpenAI apply like flat rate for everyone for sure, no
Sorry?
matter what? Like does OpenAI apply flat rates for pricing for everyone for sure, or are there any custom deals that were made with the startups?
I think for startups, again, like the credits is like where we help startups kind of start with. Other than that, like our API pricing is like right online.
Yeah, but do you like negotiate custom deals maybe for later phases for the token price, or is it like absolutely flat for everyone?
Oh, like are you asking like do we do like custom deals and contracts with customers? I think like for customers who are like scaling up really like significantly, like it's always like happy to have a conversation, but it's like not really our default.
Thank you.
Cool. There's no other questions. Thank you everyone for your time this morning.